Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the latest projections from the government scientific advisors that say that the second COVID wave that we are in the middle of at the moment is going to yield a greater death toll than the first if the Prime Minister doesn't get a grip. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, if we look at the number of COVID cases increasing since the end of August, really, we can see that there's no peak in sight just yet. Of course, you never know when you've reached the peak until you've gone over it, and very clearly gone over it. But the number of times that anti-restriction crowds, led by the likes of the Daily Express, have tried to say, oh, the numbers are plateauing. Oh, it's getting better now, it's getting better. They look utterly ridiculous when you look at this. This is, of course, the problem when you've got people with no mathematical education looking at data such as these on a day-by-day basis as opposed to the overall trend. That trend is still upwards, and a couple of things point to it being higher still in a few weeks. So the first one, so what I often do each day when I check out the data is to compare it to France's, because they are a similar sized nation. They're also having a very bad time of their second wave, and they started their second wave before us. They've also failed to even now arrest the rate of increase for whatever reason. Now, at the start of the second wave, we were 3 weeks behind France. 3 weeks behind France. Now, when I checked this morning, if you go by the daily number of cases, we're 11 days behind. So we were 3 weeks behind. We're now less than 2 weeks behind. We're about a week and a half behind. So in other words, we are progressing more quickly than France on this second wave, just as we eventually did on the first wave. The second thing is that the government have continued to ignore the urgent scientific advice for action. So when the government are not doing what scientists say is necessary, of course the situation is not really going to get better, except maybe in little isolated pockets. Now, last August, the advisors called for the government to compensate for the opening of schools by closing other infection spreaders, such as pubs. You can't just open up schools and not close something else down to compensate, they said. The R rate isn't low enough to do that. The government refused. And when the horse bolted on that one, they then said, right, okay, what you need to do now is we now need a 2-week national lockdown. We could have avoided this, but now we can't. We need what they term a circuit break. The government refused on that one too. Now the projections are for a truly horrendous death toll this winter, because if you look at our current second wave in terms of number of cases, it looks way worse than the first. Absolutely way worse than the first. But if you look at the number of deaths, the daily number of deaths, well, that looks smaller than the first wave. And you think, well, it's okay. So treatments are better. We've learnt more about it. So hopefully that's good. We may experience many more cases, but we won't experience as many deaths. And this is a pattern replicated in other countries as well, that although in some countries like France, the number of cases is worse now than in the first wave, the number of deaths stays much lower proportionally. And the government advisors, however, are saying that we won't hit the same peak as we did with the first wave. So they are not projecting at all that we are ever going to get anywhere near the peak of daily deaths that we did in the first wave. I mean, that's good. However, they also said that the second wave peak will last much longer. Now, our first wave peak lasted a lot longer than other countries. In fact, it wasn't really much of a peak, because for other countries it sort of went up and then it went down. It looks as a peak would be expected to look. Ours went up, leveled off for a month before coming back down again. It was a month before it came back down. They're saying a similar sort of thing, but for a longer period of time this winter as well. I mean, we already have by far the worst death toll in Europe. By far. If our second wave is to be even worse, then the final analysis of the second wave, once it is over, presumably next spring, is going to be a very sombre affair. Our 7-day moving average for daily deaths has just hit 200. So it's just hit 200. The chief scientific officer last month was warning that we could hit that grim milestone by mid-November. Now, he wasn't saying we would. He was just saying, look, if certain things continue, then mid-November. We've hit that 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The potential projections are now for about 500 deaths per day in a matter of weeks. Again, will we get to that point? It depends on a number of things. As before, it's not been billed as a prediction. This is not scientific advisors saying we predict this. It's them saying if things carry on a certain course, that's where you're going to end up with. Hospitals have already started cancelling operations again. There was already a backlog created from the fact that we couldn't cope with the first wave, and that backlog had not been cleared, and yet there are some hospitals who are having to cancel them again. That's going to lead to an indirect health consequence for the nation as well, because of a combination of things. Really, it's our government's failure to not only reduce the number of cases by taking the advised action. If they'd have taken the advised action, we wouldn't have as many cases, we wouldn't have as many hospitalisations, hospitals would find it easier to cope. But also in gutting the NHS to the point where we do not have the spare capacity. Many other countries do. We do not. And the wanton recklessness of Boris Johnson in getting us here, it's not just a failure to follow scientific and medical advice. He's also depriving his advisors of much needed data as well. Because it's been reported, for example, we know that our test and trace system is not coping. To be fair, scientific advisors suggest that it couldn't possibly cope with the numbers we have now, even if we had a robust system. But we cannot actually say how effective it is in reducing the transmission at all, because the government are not collecting any data on, for example, how many people with symptoms are isolated. We know it's a very low number. We know that less than 20% of people who are being asked to isolate are. We do not have any accurate figures though. The government's obsession with hiding data from anyone who might use it to criticise them means that it often doesn't exist. If we don't collect these data, they reason, then nobody can use it to point out our failings. This is why, for example, they refuse to carry out many economic analyses of the impacts of Brexit. So scientific advisors, both government appointed and independent, have been calling for a national lockdown again, because they're saying, look, everywhere's going to be in tier 3 in England soon anyway. That's basically going to be a national thing. We might as well have a proper lockdown that will actually do some good. In every report I read as well, because I don't know. I'm not a public health expert. But when you read reports of those who are, they all make it clear that we need this circuit break, as it's been termed. Not that this is the best thing. This is the thing we should do to really reduce the impact. Because what some people try and argue, oh yeah, it's all right you saying that, but what about, this or that, or the economy, or personal freedoms and things like this? What about the indirect effects of lockdowns? They're not saying it's the best thing. They're saying it's the only thing. It's the thing you need to do. There isn't anything else at this point that will work. And as anyone who's been paying attention around the world noted in spring, lockdowns can only be averted if test and trace stays on top of things. Once it gets to the point where it can't cope, a lockdown is the only way to bring the situation under control in order to get test and trace on top of it. Now, if you can keep test and trace on top of it, you can keep out of lockdown. And that's what some other countries have managed to do. Quite a lot of other countries, in fact. And our test and trace system is so bad that the number of cases would need to be brought right down in order for it to be able to work for us. We're still not, for example, testing large enough numbers of asymptomatic people. Now, that is essential to be able to ever get back to any form of normality, because the vast majority of infected and infectious, more importantly, people do not display symptoms. So until you're catching these people and getting them to isolate, we will never get on top of things. But, because our testing priority for the government has been more about fiddling the figures to make it sound like we have a huge capacity rather than actually increasing that capacity, We don't have the capacity to test people routinely, such as, for example, frontline health or social care workers. The result is that we have an army of people going around unwittingly spreading the virus to others. They've no idea. Operation Moonshot was supposed to deal with that with an actual mass testing programme, but that turned out to be yet another one of Dominic Cummings's brain farts that has been abandoned a few weeks later. Don't worry though, the £100 billion that was allocated to it is still going to be wasted. They're not going to pass up the chance to piss away more public money. So here we are, we've got a second wave which is still climbing, you know, a death rate which is rising and going to rise further, headed into a winter where some hospitals, I mean, we're still months away from winter. Some hospitals are still right now unable to cope with what they've just got now. A government that continue to refuse to take the necessary action. And of course, we know from lessons around the world, the longer they delay, the worse it will eventually be. The best hope now, actually, is in backbench Conservative MPs who have teamed up with other MPs across the House, along with scientists, in order to campaign for the government to publish a clear roadmap out of restrictions. Obviously, we know the government don't have one. It's not just that they're keeping it secret. They don't have one. But maybe they could put enough pressure on the government to actually come up with one, at which point they'll have to actually follow the scientific advice. That is our best hope right now. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.